Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining us. This is the final session of our three-part webinar series on the Bay Area Seize the Narrative Playbook, which is the results of our month-long coalition-driven initiative to advance housing and racial justice here in the Bay Area. Offering research-driven and field practice strategies, tactics, and messages, our Bay Area Initiative's work aims to seize this powerful moment to drive new narratives to support our movement. My name is Alina Harway. I'm the Communications Director at the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, and I'm humbled and honored to be the project lead of the Bay Area Shift the Narrative Initiative and working with you all and so many others in moving this work forward. And I'm very excited to have you here with us today, whether this is your first time engaging with us or if you've been with us through the full webinar series or beyond. We're really grateful to have you here today. Today's session is going to be really special. It's going to be geared even more towards interactive two-way conversation. So your presence and your participation is really critical for yourself. Of course, you get from it what you put in, but also to us as we work to build together where this initiative is going to continue to grow ahead. So please be present with us here today. Hopefully you were able to grab your lunch, grab your water, whatever you need to be here, close out those tabs, and let's take a look at what we're getting into today. I'm going to do just a really quick technical overview of Zoom for anyone who needs a refresher. We've got a couple tools we're using today. The first, which folks are already starting to use there, the chat box. It's great if you can drop your name and hellos in there. As you're doing so, please make sure you use that little toggle in the bottom where it's a blue bar and it says currently for many of you to all panelists. Go ahead and drop that down and have it go to all panelists and all attendees so we can all enjoy your messages and not just the panelists. Other tools we're going to be using today are the QA box. If the chat box is going to be anything like previous sessions, it's going to be a lot of movement in there, and we want to make sure your really great comments that you're looking for feedback on or your specific questions you're looking to answers to, that they don't get lost in the chat box. So the QA is a place where you can make sure that those get pinned and held so we can carry those questions forward to the panelists. And then lastly, I mentioned that, the session is going to be a little bit different. We're going to have a section of today where we really want to hear from you all about the work that you're doing and the ideas you have, and then the challenges and questions you have about how to specifically be embedding and applying these narrative shift learnings and recommendations in the work that you're doing in the day-to-day. And at that time, we're going to all experiment together. This will be new for all of us, where we'll use both the chat box and this little feature. If you click on the participant chat box, you should have a little place where it gives you an option to raise your hand. So we'll use that option after you've sort of waited in the chat box. If you want to raise your hand, we'll actually be able to turn your audio on so you can deliver a little more than you can normally type into that chat box. So those are some of the tools I wanted to go through really quickly. We'll have a chance to review that raising your hand and turning your audio on when we get into that part of the section. Just wanted to flag that for you all today, that is ahead. For now, I see so many people dropping their name and location into the chat box. So wonderful to see you all. Some repeat names, some new or new to me names. We're so happy to have you. I'm going to actually give you all another question to invite you to come back, even if you've already introduced yourself. Pop back in and tell us a little more to gear us up for that interactive dialogue that's happening this afternoon and really set the stage for our panelists. We want to hear specifically about how you're thinking about narrative shift in your own work. So the question that I have for you all is, what's a specific campaign, project, or initiative that you're working on, and what are your ideas or questions on how you're going to be applying this narrative shift research strategy and messaging guidance to that project? Now, we're not asking you to write, multiple paragraphs on that, but maybe just the quick and dirty, what's the thing you're working on, and what's like one idea you have that you're excited about, or one question you have that's really puzzling you on how to bring this work into that initiative. And so we're going to be monitoring that as that comes through to really gear up the conversations we're having with our panelists shortly later in the session. I see Amanda from San Diego is talking about a public awareness campaign, Federation TV. She's keeping us on pins and needles about what her idea or question is, and hopefully others will start to put some other notes in there as well. We'll come back to that. What I want to do now to start today's session is to begin by showing a short video from Black Lives Matter as an example of some of the ways we're going to be talking about this work. Some of the things we're going to be talking about today, which is, how do we actually create new narratives, specifically amid the work we're already doing on specific policies and campaigns? How do we create new narratives as we go about our daily work? So I'm going to, if all goes well, I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm going to hit play on this video, and y'all will give me thumbs up if you can hear me, or chat me if it's not working.
Until Black people are free, no one is fully free. Because the issues that affect Black people the most affect everyone. Everyone. Can you imagine? Can you imagine an America with no police brutality? Police brutality. An America without mass shootings and gun violence, mass incarceration, children in cages, and racist immigration policies. Can you imagine an America without government corruption, with no economic injustice, an America without LGBTQIA+ people being excluded, voter suppression, environmental degradation, lack of education and poor health care, racial injustice? Can you imagine an America where oppression and fear are dissolved, where we are whole and healed? It's time to center what matters and fight for the change we need. Let's get free. Let's get free. This is What Matters 2020.
I have watched this video so many times, and I still get goosebumps when I watch that. I find this video so powerful, and yeah, I'm seeing in the chat box folks are agreeing. You tell me if I'm not the only one with goosebumps here. It's so powerful. It's a video that quickly, in a minute, it guides us to vision and imagining a different future for ourselves and our communities. Even while it lists out dozens of specific policies and issue areas that need to be tackled, they did this under an overarching vision and through an overarching lens. They talked about police brutality, mass shooting and gun violence, immigration policy, economic injustice, LGBTQ, environment, education, racial injustice. Those are just some of the policy areas they named in this video. And then they called to us, center what matters, fight for the change we need, let's get free. I'd love to know if you have any reactions to this, and just a quick reminder, make sure you set your chat so they're going to all panelists and attendees, not just panelists, so we can all see your messages. How did you feel when you saw this video? How did folks feel when they saw this video? Did you see yourself in it? Did you hear your policies and your issue areas in this video? I did. I did. And I think so many of us here probably heard our issues listed and saw our values represented and found a vision that we could get behind. And I think that we probably felt the urgency and timeliness of this message as well. Stuart's checking in to see, do we read the chat box? Deborah's saying this video inspired her and shows the attachment part of the playbook, values focused. Susan says grateful because it said what we feel. Thank you so much for your comments. You know, it's great to sort of hear your reactions as well, and see if we're all feeling the same way when we see a video like that and we hear a message delivered in that way. You know, as timely as this video feels, I do want to share it was developed in 2019 as part of the Black Lives Matter work planning for 2020, as they decided that in 2020 they were going to run a campaign to galvanize supporters and allies to the polls this election cycle. So what makes it so timely and urgent, despite the fact that it was produced last fall, certainly the external environment that we are in, which just really continues to highlight the need for this work and specifically the racial injustice that our nation is confronting in this moment. But really, I think that even without those external environments, it was about the way they created this frame, how they offered us a slew of policy issues that we needed to do, that we needed to work on, that we need to have solutions for, but they gave us a bigger lens to view it through, to understand what this meant. Gane says, I love that it says, let's get free, because it's an invitation to join in on the fight for liberation. And that the fight is for everyone to join. So by joining, you are fighting for your liberation as well. So as we build our narratives here in the Bay Area, I wanted to start us with this video because I thought it was just a wonderful example of how our own messages, our own hooks, our own campaigns are going to be speaking to specific moments and urgency. And Will's going to talk specifically about those tactics in action later. But even as we're doing that, we need to do it while painting a bigger picture and a bigger frame so that we are shifting the lens through which folks are hearing the specific policies. And this video, I thought, was just a great illustration of how you can do both together. So this is what we're getting into today. And, you know, to recognize that in previous weeks, we've reviewed our initiative's playbook, which offers tactical guidance and strategies on how to advance our work. Last week, we dug deep on the research that informed those recommendations. You should have copies of all those items, the playbook and the research slides. Those were also emailed out this morning. We can drop some links in the chat box if anybody wants them at hand. And yes, I promise recordings of all these sessions are going to be made available shortly. But we've done that work leading up to today, where we wanted to really dig into what does this look like in practice, specifically, practically, and realistically. How do we create narratives in our day-to-day work? How do we craft long-term narratives while fighting to win critical policies and solutions? And I start here with this question because this has been a really common theme throughout our work, throughout this initiative, around how do we balance the needs of this long-term strategy that we know we need to build power and shift hearts and minds, and then how do we balance that with the short-term urgency of the campaigns? And when we started this work, we saw them like this, that they were at odds with each other. And the reality is, as we have been moving through this work, we have found that these are not in conflict at all, and in fact, they rely on one another for impact. So as we're digging in on this work to create long-term values change, which of course is the fundamental goal of narrative shift, we're trying to create long-term values change. When you think about how do you actually establish, seize, and set those narratives, there's not some magical narrative plane that people are ready to tune into and listen to. You have to be delivering that through the immediate urgent needs and campaigns. These are the vehicles for delivering the messages that can shape the frames. And then of course, as we're finding impact in shifting that narrative, we're going to be more successful with those short-term needs. So in fact, they are not at odds at all. They work right hand in hand. At a session NPH held with Alliance for a Just Society last year, we talked about the interplay of those spaces of power, the political gains, the power building, and the shaping of the narrative. And I really loved how Libero Della Piano, our guide in that session, how he described this interplay as the campaigns, which of course are critical in their own right. They offer an opportunity to build bigger and better footholds and handholds in the climb for big system change. So when you look at that mountain, this big long-term systems change that we're working on, every one of those campaigns we win allows us to climb that mountain. And it's really on that note, I wanted to acknowledge a few things about our Bay Area Initiatives project and process before we get into today's session. There are many diverse organizations at our table at this session and in this work. And we may not agree on every one of those policies or bills. Each one of those footholds may not have everybody united behind it, but we do agree on the mountain we're climbing to advance housing and racial justice. And we can be grateful for every one of those footholds and handholds and work on the ones that are true to us. Having said that, it can be hard, and there's ongoing conversation and question amongst our coalition and movement about how we build together when those footholds are not, universally embraced. Now, I think you've heard this protest metaphor before. Hat tip, Ryan, Nicole Austin. But just to remind us that we can all come to the same protest with the same values and sing the same chant and still bring our own signs. And today's discussion really aims to help us explore how we carry our truths forward into our signs while holding true also to the research playbook and our joint collective efforts of the mountain. Lastly, I want to note that this work has been and will continue to be an iterative process. We learn, we embed, we evaluate, we test, and then we share and learn and embed and evaluate, test, rinse and repeat. That remains true today. We have shared our playbook and research, and in this session, we're talking more about where our messages are today, but we do expect this to be an ongoing project. So please, today and beyond, I really urge you to be an active participant. If you attend these sessions, read our playbook, share our materials, and then go store them in a Google folder or Dropbox folder and say like, oh, that was cool. Okay, now back to my regular work. We won't be successful. We need to keep coming together and keep learning from and with each other. We need to keep applying. We need to keep sharing. We need to keep testing. Now, our initiative, the Shift the Narrative Initiative, as it's called for now, is going to continue to develop more resources, tools, platforms, and avenue to foster those conversations, learnings, and applications ahead. But we really need you to participate, to invite your colleagues, peers, allies, and partners to do so as well. We'll have more to share about some of those elements that are coming out of our planned next steps, but we're really going to rely on you to weigh in and share your ideas, your challenges, what's going to be helpful in your work, so we can make sure that this work is being refined and shaped so that our offerings can have the impact you need and that we need together. Now, every session you've heard me read out the names of the leadership team and the collaborative table who to this point have been the ones so deeply engaging to shape this work. And I'm going to do it again because we really could not have done this work without them. So thank you, East Bay Housing Organizations, Eastside Arts Alliance, Pico, California, Working Partnerships. Thank you, ACE. Thank you, Bar High Rise Together, Hamilton Families, Housing Leadership Council, Monument Impact, North Bay Organizing Project, Public Advocates, Sacred Heart Community Service, San Mateo Anti-Displacement Coalition, Tech Equity, Urban Habitat, San Francisco Foundation, Great Communities Collaborative, and of course, all of my colleagues and peers at the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. I make a point to acknowledge that I've read those names every session because we know that moving forward, we're going to have a bigger circle, a bigger coalition, a bigger movement that is helping shape, implement, and execute this work. And I'm not going to be able to read every organization's name as we continue to come together. But I want you to know, recognize, and see yourself in this work and see the power from you and this movement together. You are going to be the vehicle for moving this work forward. You are the coalition, you are the movement. So I really want to thank you for being here. All right, hey, what to expect from today? We've got a packed agenda. First, I'm going to have Will Valverde from M&R come on, who's going to offer some practical guidance on what it looks like and what it takes to craft narratives in our day-to-day. Then we're going to have a facilitated conversation with our researchers and message experts around dispatches from the field. What are the strategies that work to advance issues like housing? That's where, make sure those questions you want answered end up in the QA box. And then the third part of our session today, we're going to do that thing we haven't done before that I talked about earlier. In addition to using the QA box, we're going to invite folks to raise their hand, get their audio turned on, and dialogue around specific campaigns, projects, initiatives in your own world. We want to be learning from each other, so we're going to be inviting volunteers to tell us your ideas and game plan for moving the research forward, or your questions or needs for support in how to do that. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Will.
Hi, everybody. Get my camera going so you can see me. Hi. It's not working. Well, I'm not that important to look at. Oh, hi, there I am. Hi, I'm going to be sharing a little bit of an exploration of how we're taking all of these raw materials that are coming out. They're not really raw, they've been heavily processed materials coming out of the research that has happened already, and start plugging those into the sort of day-to-day work that we do. And day-to-day really, I think for most of us means week to week and month to month, because we're generally keeping on the same topic, the same campaign over a period of time, and we want to be able to tie all of that work together. So trying to come from the sort of very high level, what do we believe in? What is the future we see in our work, and trying to make it be something that we can plug into the sort of ongoing campaign work that is happening. So I'm going to be sharing my screen here. as it responds in a second. There we go. Okay. I'm going to walk through a little bit of how I see sort of the real opportunities that came out of the research in terms of our messaging and how we can be applying that. And then I'm going to walk through a little bit sort of how we approach at M&R developing creative that really gets people to do things, developing sort of message by message, line by line, word by word messaging approach that gets people to want to take action, to want to show up and volunteer, to want to give money, all the things that we need people to do to actually create change. And then at the end of that, we'll talk. So what we've learned, I think, coming out of the research that has happened are the sort of the three big things that we need to know in order to develop effective creative. So first is we need to know who we are speaking to. And I think really importantly, the way the campaign playbook breaks it out is really helps us to understand that we are not speaking to a particular audience. We actually have three big buckets of people, three different main audiences that we're going to be reaching. And we're going to need to use different messages depending on who those audiences are. We need to know about what messages are moving them, and this applies broadly. We saw this coming out of the focus groups and out of the research and the survey work, that there are some messages that resonate with a really broad segment of the population. There are some messages that work more effectively for a narrower segment, and we want to be making sure that we're applying the right messages to the right audiences. And then finally, there are some things that we might want to avoid. And these are messaging points or ways of talking about our issues that either don't resonate with people, they don't motivate people, or in a lot of cases, they actually they create opposition. They remind people of what they are worried about, what they might oppose. And we want to just sort of sidestep those as much as we can so that we can be putting forth messages that people really respond to. I didn't know that Alina was going to be showing that video from Black Lives Matter, but I think it was such a perfect encapsulation of how we should be thinking of our messaging, because I think what resonated, and she mentioned that that video is over a year old, and it still feels really timely because the values and the vision that they are presenting, that hasn't changed. And I think that as we think about our long-term narrative shift, it is largely about values and about vision. Those are the sort of the through lines that are going to carry through regardless of what's happening in the moment. And if we can say something that is meaningful about our values and what we believe right now in this moment, it's still going to be true a year from now. It's going to be true 5 years from now. We may have made progress on individual issues, but that values and that vision language is going to be something that can be consistent. It's something that is also more likely to be true and consistent across different members of the table and just coalition partners. If we are talking about the future that we want to see, that might be the same, even if the way we are trying to get there or what we see as sort of our core priority in this moment might be a little bit different. We might have different actions that we're trying to get people to do. And that's the second part of it, is the moment, understanding what action matters right now, understanding what people are worried about in this moment, understanding where the opportunities for change lie. Those are the things that can really change and evolve over time. And so we need to be making sure that those all reflect the values and vision, they fall underneath it, but that's where we have the flexibility to say, we're talking to this audience today, and they need to know that the most important thing they can be doing is X, Y, or Z. And so that's where we have the ability to sort of really customize given the moment or given the audience. As we think about messaging, I think we oftentimes start from the place of what is going to get people to change, either what they think and believe or what they are doing. And sort of the two like sides of the balance here that we think about, first is the opportunity. This is sort of the positive frame. People want to imagine a better future. We want to present them with a vision of what the Bay Area can be. It can be a more just place. It can be a place that people can afford to live, where people are happier, where people enjoy their communities and feel like they're a part of their communities. All of that is part of that positive vision that we can move toward, that we can say the future can be brighter than you think if you follow this path and if we really reach for it, if we work for it. The flip side of that is the idea of a threat. People are genuinely afraid things will get worse. They see things that they don't like in the world, and they're afraid that that's going to be the way things are forever, and we can't undo that damage. And in particular, people tend to have a lot of loss aversion. So the idea that I'm really motivated by not wanting to lose what I already have. I want to cling to it tightly. And anything that presents a threat to that is something that I'm going to react against really strongly. that is a place where we have some real risks in the messaging that we put out there, and we want to make sure that we are not triggering that sensation in people in a way that is counterproductive. So people who feel comfortable already, people who feel like they have been one of the lucky ones who has a housing situation that they are comfortable with, that are happy with, they don't want to feel like what they have is at risk if we move toward a more just future. At the same time, there's an opportunity here to say, actually, the things that you love about the Bay Area, about your living situation, about your community, those things are at risk, and they are put at risk by the inability of people to have safe, stable housing. And so the thing that so rather than saying there's a place of resistance there, we want to say, doing this work, moving toward a more just housing process, moving toward racial justice, all of those things will actually allow us to preserve the things that you love and to enhance them and move toward a better place. I want to take a little bit of time talking about some of the values and vision statements that really had a lot of resonance in the research and that came out of the campaign playbook. So one of these is that a decent place to live is a basic human right. I want to be really clear here that this is not necessarily the specific language that you might use for every audience, but the core concept here, the idea that everybody deserves as a basic human right, as by being a person, by being a member of our community, they deserve to be in a decent place to live that they can afford. That is something that a value that can really embrace and we can speak about consistently over time. So in a positive frame, this becomes, we can live in a healthy, stable community where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. This is sort of the baseline vision of what housing justice means in a way that people can sort of understand the basic sort of human moral value here of everybody deserves this. The flip side of that is to say, there's actually a real threat here. If we wanted to put this in a more negative frame, we can say that the housing crisis, housing injustice, puts pressure on our community in all of these different ways. It affects our schools, it affects healthcare, it affects the economy. All of the things that sort of we value about our community are there. It also affects the way we think about our own identity. Because if we are not fighting for this basic human right, if you agree that this matters and that you are on board with this vision, can you really think of yourself as a compassionate person, as an activist person, as somebody who cares about their community if you're not doing the work to make this, to fix housing injustice? Okay, the next value here is our community thrives because it is diverse. This is something that really resonated strongly with people in the focus groups and in the research. We see that there's an opportunity here. We can talk about this in a positive way of saying, we can build a Bay Area that encourages diversity, that embraces all of our communities, and that fosters healthier, thriving communities. This can be put into a more solidly racial justice frame as well. So we can talk about particular communities. We can talk about, and this depends on your audience and on your particular organization's focus, but you can really talk about this as saying we can lift up the communities that we care about, and we can lift up the Black community. We can lift up the Indigenous communities. We can lift up the Latinx communities. This is all part of saying embracing that diversity and using it as a positive value. Now, the threat language here, the sort of the negative frame that we can also use is to say that we know that housing justice and racial injustice are tied together, and that when we see the rising cost of housing, crowding people out, making it harder to make a living, making it harder for people to take care of their families, making it harder for communities to thrive, that hits communities of color in particular, and that injustice is only exacerbated and made worse, and something that we are continuing to carry through over time. So they threaten the thing that we value, which is that diversity of the Bay Area. Our children deserve a future in our community. It's like a really baseline thing. It's something that is going to maybe resonate more particularly for parents as they see their kids growing up. They imagine what that future is going to be like. They imagine that their children, you may want to have your kids at least have the opportunity to be in the community that they grew up in, and knowing that that's going to be impossible for a generation of people or generations to follow. So that sort of basic idea of maintaining continuity in our community and allowing the next generation to have opportunities that we want them to have. So in a positive frame, that's saying we're actually going to create the opportunities for prosperity that our kids deserve. They need that. They deserve it. We owe it to them. In a more negative frame, in a threat language, it is saying the risk of there. It's sort of really directed to the flip side of that, is just to say our children will not be allowed to do that. You'll never see your grandchildren again in the most basic way, and saying that we owe them better. So there's a sense of responsibility here on both frames, and there's a sense of doing the right thing by the next generation, by our kids. And then the last one I'm going to talk about here in this section is talking about the possibility that is opened up by housing justice. So a Bay Area with housing justice, or a community with housing justice, is a place where anyone can pursue their dreams. It's a place where your neighborhood can thrive and be a thriving community, where we can come together, where people can build the futures that they deserve. It is this idea that this is a way of creating opportunity, of creating a possibility for a brighter future that you can see yourself being a part of. The reverse side of that is to say everything crumbles without housing justice. And we see this. We see that we've seen how important it has been in the current moment when we are thinking about healthcare, and that the idea of having people respond to COVID when they don't have a safe, stable place to call home, that is made worse. So even something that feels disconnected like healthcare, or can be on the surface a separate issue, is tied into this. And so we limit our possibility, we limit our futures, and we cut off the opportunity to make progress in all these other ways that we also care about. So for every one of these, as we talk about these values and vision, these should be threads that we see coming up again and again. It always gives us this sort of high level frame for talking about an individual action, an individual piece of legislation, a community action, whatever it might be. We can frame all of those things within this broad vision, always with a sense of change. So change for the better, or the threat of change for the worse, the threat of a missed opportunity. We can always talk about that. We don't never want to talk about stability. We want to talk about the ways that things can be made different in the future. I want to talk a little bit about our particular audiences as we're reaching them. And the way we are talking about audiences in this case is really pulled directly from the campaign playbook. So there are going to be other ways of breaking down your audience. So you may have an audience that is my volunteers, and I know who they are. They probably fall into the category here of your base, right? They're going to fall right into that. You're going to have some externally defined audiences where the differences are not so clear cut, and where you don't get to pick sort of, we're going to only talk to our base supporters, we're only going to talk to people on the fence, we're only going to talk to the people who are opposed to us. You might think of something like the city council or the state legislature, where there is sort of, you didn't get to pick your audience, you're going to have to deal with a range of people who have a range of commitments and affinities for the work that you're doing. By beginning from a place of sort of where are people relative to our goals, relative to our values, and relative to our work, it lets us sort of fine tune a little bit. We're going to see that there are some common threads. When you see something coming up again and again as both sort of a base case, a base messaging, a sort of on the fence messaging, an opposition messaging, those are the threads that you're going to want to present to those mixed audiences. But we have opportunities to be more bold in our language when we're talking to audiences that we know that are with us. And we have some sort of red flags and some warnings that we're going to want to stay away from, so that we don't trigger opposition, that sort of resistance and the digging out of heels with audiences that may not be on board with us already. This is what I just said a little bit. So when we talk about our different goals, our different audiences, with our base audience, what we really want to do is turn those values, those things we agree on, into action. So we want to make sure that if they sort of say like, yes, I believe in housing justice, we want them to say, housing justice is one of the most important things to me. I know that I can't make progress on all these other things I care about unless I'm working toward housing justice. So that has to be a part of it. It's not just about saying you're convinced, now you're extra convinced. It's about saying this should be your priority, emphasizing the urgency of action, and making change really feel achievable. One of the things that we have to avoid is a sense of, well, things are worse now than they were last year, so they're only going to go downhill forever. We need to be able to really convincingly express the idea that by making this a priority, by acting now, we can make a difference on this priority of housing justice, which is also tied into so many other things. For our persuadable audience, a lot of this is about saying this is not just an individual issue that exists off to the side, but it is something that is actually relevant to your core values and what you think of as your own identity. So you can become a person who cares about this in a more deep way. We also want to emphasize a little bit more the personal benefits. So making sure that people see themselves in the fight for housing justice, that they don't see that as something that is for somebody else. Again, I think this is something that was really effectively done in that Black Lives Matter video, where it was speaking to a broad audience of people who maybe have not been invested in that fight up until now, but they see that and they see a place for themselves in that movement. And then finally, we have our contrarians, the people who are not with us. What we really want to do is, in some ways, set them aside to the extent that we can. But when we're speaking to them, we want to make them feel like there's something here beyond their sort of own, whether it's apathy or resistance to change, to saying, the status quo, the thing that is happening now, the direction that we are moving presents a threat to me as well. And not all change is going to be bad for me. If in fact the status quo will end up damaging me because I am also affected by housing justice, even if I don't feel that urgent need in my own life right now. This is going to be one of their trickier ones. I'm actually very interested in hearing other viewpoints on this because I think this needle is one of the hardest ones to thread. And I know that other folks, in particular Dr. Manuel, really thought a lot about sort of how we pivot here, how we sort of communicate with these audiences. So when we talk about what the base should hear, we want them to hear a few different things that are largely about making change feel possible and urgent. So we want them to know that they're not alone, that they are part of a bigger movement that agrees with them, that believes in the same things that they believe in, and that they can be a part of. So the idea is this is not something that is your responsibility, but it is a movement that you can be a part of. We want to connect housing justice to other core values. So somebody who is with us on housing justice very likely also cares about racial justice. We want them to see that that is part and parcel of the same fight, that the movement is the same. If you believe in equality and diversity, this is something that you should care about. If you believe about dignity for low-income workers, higher wages, housing justice is part of that. There is no way to make progress on some of these issues without making progress on all of them. And when we lift up people who are struggling with housing, we are lifting up the communities and the values that we really care about. We want to talk about housing justice as something that we deserve. This is not something that we are being asked to be given. It is something that we work hard for every day through our jobs, by caring for our communities, by caring for our families. This is something, housing justice, safe, stable housing, a decent place to live, is something that we are owed as individuals and as a community. It's not something that we should be begging and pleading for. It is something that we are entitled to demand. And that is motivating. That is about turning it into action. That this movement affects everyone, that the progress we make here will affect communities we care about, that this is about diversity. So tying back into those values we talked about caring about racial justice, valuing diversity within our communities, caring about making sure that our kids have a place that a future that they can look toward and say that our children will be able to stay in this community. That's what we're saying. Your action is not just about you, it's about everybody else as well, and that you are part of that bigger thing. And then finally, we want to make sure that the base here is that action is needed, that there is something that they can do that will make a difference, that there's an impact that they can have. And that's going to be really, really different depending on the moment, on the situation, on sort of where your community is, what you're fighting for. But that need for action is a message that your base should be hearing every single time you speak to them. They should always be hearing that there is something that they can do that will matter, that there's a specific ask and a thing that they can do that will make a difference. Those sort of in-between audiences, those people who are persuadable but aren't really excited about housing justice yet, those people who feel like maybe this isn't really their fight and it's not for them, we want them to hear some overlapping message with a little bit of a different emphasis. So we want them to hear that their own neighborhood, the place where they live, can be better. If you live in a neighborhood that is not diverse, and you feel like, well, that's a fight for over there because here in my community, we are doing fine, we can afford our housing, we want them to know that this will affect them and will make their community a better place to live. It will make for better schools, better education systems, a better environment for local businesses to thrive, more of a coherent community that is tied together, and a place where your future will actually be better in the place where you live if we actually move toward a more just housing system. We want people to feel like they're going to be left behind if they don't get engaged with this. So I think this is something that we are seeing a lot of, again, over the last few months. The protests for Black Lives, from George Floyd on to Breonna Taylor, all the different places where people feel like, oh, wait, I missed this. I was letting this fight happen without me, and that was wrong. And people sort of opening their eyes a little bit to saying, this is actually something that I need to be a part of. So I want to be on the right side of that personally, because it affects how I think about myself. I want to think of myself as a good person who is involved in the fight for justice. But I also want to know that if we don't do this, the next town over is going to be doing better than we are. If we don't solve the housing crisis where we are going to be left behind while somebody else solves it, and that becomes the place where people want to be. So we want people to feel like this is actually going to improve their own lives, their own sense of self-worth, as well as the community that they live in. Some of the same language about this is what you are owed, this is for everyone, I think really makes sense, again, for this audience. And then we really want to make sure that for this audience, they understand that a better system is needed, that this is not just about personal virtue, that is not just about sort of who deserves what, but that people cannot make this change individually. It needs to be a systematic change. It needs to be something that we are all working toward and that is being made at a systematic level, because without that, we cannot make this progress, and we are putting at risk all the things that you personally have worked for are at risk with a sort of with a broken system. And then finally, what contrarians should hear. So this is a place where there's a lot of risk in what they are saying, because there's so much opportunity for that resistance to spring up, for people to dig in their heels and say, that's not what I want. Here we see a little bit more, in a lot of ways, practical arguments, things that are less about these sort of like high-minded values, but that really get down to like, what are we going to do? So housing policy can help control costs, that this is something that affects everyone, that whether or not you are one of the lucky ones, whether or not you have been in the Bay Area for 100 years and you bought your house in 1962 for $5,000, that you are still going to be priced out, or your children will, or people you care about will be. So housing policy that helps control costs helps everyone, including you, that there's a personal stake at this. The idea that our children deserve better, I think, should be a central argument here, because this is a place where there really was broad agreement in the responses that we got from people that were spoken to. Even if they were resistant to almost every other aspect of housing justice, there's a place here of like, well, yes, but the next generation should have an opportunity here too. My kids need to have a place where they can also thrive. And that's what we're building here. The sense of you are owed this, that we are making a better community and you deserve it as well, that you benefit from this and that your loved ones benefit from this, your neighborhood, your community, that all happens as well. And then finally, again, the shifting the responsibility and saying this is about systemic change. This is not because you've done something wrong and you've ended up not caring about this. It's that we need to create a better system that works for everybody, and that you can actually be a part of that. Your personal choices can still be your own, and we can still build a better system for everybody. There's a set of language that we saw really drove either limited appeal or really drew sharp reactions against and sort of generated that opposition. These are maybe not words that you should never ever say, but you should really be comfortable with your audience and know exactly who you're speaking to before you venture into these, because these are just some really dangerous areas. So when we start to say, using these divisive categories, saying this is going to be better for renters than for homeowners, homeowners need to know this. When we start to sort of pivot and divide some of our audiences, some of our community against other people, that makes people feel like, well, that's not me, that's for somebody else. And that just creates a lot of risk. There are some situations where it's unavoidable to talk about these categories of people in the relationship to housing, but it's really fraught. And so our focus should be on community. Our focus should be on your neighborhood. It should be on our town, on our city, on our county, on the place that affects all of us, that we are all a part of, that we can all move together as one. There were not a lot of great responses to the idea of let's make room for everybody, or our community has room for everybody, everybody can be here. So I would want to shift a little bit more toward the idea of individual opportunity where anyone can thrive. So not let's just keep on bringing more people in because people start to feel weird about that, but saying we want to make sure that people can thrive here, that anyone can build a life and a future that they and their family can be happy about and be thriving in. We saw not great reactions to the idea of housing justice as a way of fixing or addressing past inequities. So our focus here should always be on sort of what is happening now, and saying that that doesn't mean that we cannot reference the history of racial injustice, but what we really actually want to talk about is the current reality of racial justice and injustice. We want to say that right now this is our fight, not because we want to fix what happened in the past, but because we can't move forward into the future that we deserve unless we address this right now. And then one just sort of red flag that seems to have come up again and again is this value of home ownership as sort of a mark of prosperity, as sort of the American dream, the thing that everybody should be working toward, is just very, very fraught. So I would say unless that particular value is like central to the thing that you are working on in a particular moment or campaign, it's better to just set that aside and not be trying to engage in the struggle over should we be valuing home ownership over all else. We can talk about so many shared values that that's a fight that we don't necessarily need to pick all the time. So that is sort of particular to what we saw coming out of the research and particular messaging points. I want to take a quick tour through how we think about developing effective creative for campaigns generally at MNR, how we sort of get people to do the things we want them to do, because this is sort of what, in the email that you're writing tomorrow, in the press release that you're putting out, in the creative that you are putting out into the world, that messaging, what should you be making sure that you're including as part of that? So in general, when we talk about good creative, what we're actually talking about is creative that works. And so oftentimes we get caught up into making something that feels flashy or innovative or beautiful, something that feels sort of aesthetically pleasing to the people who are creating it. And in general, what we have found is that that is not our goal, and it should not be our goal. Our goal should be effective creative, creative that does make somebody do something. That doing a thing may mean having a conversation with their family. It may mean calling up their state legislator. It may mean showing up at a protest. It may mean writing a letter to the editor. There's a million different things that we can ask somebody to be doing, but all of our creative should be designed to make them want to do that thing and for that thing to feel like the most important thing they can be doing. Now, for those of you who represent arts groups, that may be different. The priority, it may actually be centrally important to have creative that is beautiful or that is fun or that feels like something you've never seen before. I think that speaks to the authenticity of your voice, and we're going to talk about authenticity a little bit. So our general guidance of like, don't worry about if it looks really nice, I think can actually be maybe sidestepped a little bit and put in a different frame for those of you who are sort of, well, that's part of who you are as an organization. So the 5 elements of effective creative, these are sort of the common threads that we see again and again. Our urgency, the need to take action right now, the need, talking about what is going to change, what needs to be changed, the impact, so this is why taking action, why getting involved as an individual member of this audience is going to make a difference and contribute to change. It needs to be relevant to your audience, and you need to be speaking with authenticity. So why are you the right voice and the right person to be carrying this message, either the right person or the right organization to be carrying this message? I'm going to dig into each one of these a little bit further. So we want to be talking about urgency. When we talk about urgency, it's not just why does this matter? We often get hung up into what is our vision, but actually why does this matter right now? Who is being affected? Why is this the right moment? This can be, it needs to be focused in a moment in time. So if we have a message that works today, it may not work 2 weeks from now because things have changed in the world. We always want to make sure that the messaging we're putting out feels like it's happening in real time. It's about this moment in time. And it has to be about change. So we are talking about the boulder in this case is like, picture a boulder at the precipice of a cliff. It is about to come plummeting down. There's that moment where it is balanced perfectly, and there is this threat that is going to come crashing down on everything that we hold dear. That is a moment of urgency. We can talk about that looming threat, that looming disaster. There's a sense of anticipation at a rocket launch as we're counting down, where we know that something really amazing is about to happen. So there's this amazing opportunity. So that is also that moment of change just before we take off into a better future, into a better world. That is the moment for change that is imminent. That's that rocket. And then there's the fire that needs to be put out. There is disaster all around us. There are people who are suffering, and there is a moment for us to come together as a community to address that. We need to do it now. We cannot wait another moment, because the thing that we want to avoid, the pain that we want to alleviate is happening in this moment. Now, that urgency can be in a particular message. It can be implicit. If we talk about we can say urgency in an explicit way by saying, right now, this is what's happening. There's a vote coming down in the state legislature on Friday. We need to make sure they hear from us right now. It can also be implicit because we're talking about all the different issues that matter to us. When we're talking about the ways that racial injustice are perpetuated, when we're talking about how that affects housing justice and how those issues go back and forth, the urgency of the moment of the fight for racial justice that people feel right now then is imbued in the fight for housing justice as well. So it doesn't always have to be that we are saying this vote is happening on Tuesday, or you have to show up at this community event tomorrow. There can be a general sense of there's an opportunity now, there's a risk right now, it's tied to this moment. When we talk about need, this is a place for us to be really specific. So we want to talk about who is affected. It can be an individual person by telling somebody's story. It can be a community. It can be our entire city or town. We want to talk about what happens if we act. What is the vision for a better future? What is the change that we can make? And also we want to talk about what happens if we don't act. If we fail in this moment, who's going to be affected by that? We need to talk about why this matters. And we need to be really careful to make sure that we are elevating need without just either wallowing in helplessness in a sense of like change can't happen, but also without saying, look at this thing that has happened, look at these people who are suffering, don't we want to go save them? So that sense of saviorism, I think, is a real threat. I think a lot of nonprofits often stray away from their core values because they want to be able to talk about need in a way that feels really dramatic. And so I think this is something that every organization is working toward in different ways. I think community-based groups, like most of the folks on this call, I think are particularly well adapted to talking about the realities of their community in a way that doesn't exploit suffering. But it's just a real danger, and I think it's something that we see go awry, and people sort of misusing need to further their own needs and their own agenda and their own sort of organization's goals, rather than actually focusing on the need and the change that we can make. We want to make people feel like their involvement matters. So when we talk about impact, we want to talk about what we want people to do. So we want you to show up at an event. We want you to hold a sign. We want you to sign a petition. That needs to be directly connected to the need. So it needs to be, if you take this action, that need will be addressed. Doesn't mean it's going to solve it all together. We want to make sure that we are describing the plausible impact. A lot of this is how we talk about movement building. So it's not that your action matters, it's that our collective voice makes a difference. So we want it to be talking about how we are moving from the need that we see toward that values and vision that we are having as a through line through our communications. All of our communications to be relevant. And when we talk about relevance, this is about who is listening, who is our audience. This is part of why it's so important to think before we start putting out messaging about who is going to be in our audience. Part of this is sort of tactical relevance. So if you're writing a message that is meant to speak to a particular audience, we want to make sure that we are targeting the audience that needs to hear that message, depending on where they live. It might be different. If you're on one block, it might be different than a block away in terms of the messaging we want you to hear. In a lot of situations, the audience you're speaking to is also your subject. They're also the community that you are talking about. So when we want to lift up a community, when we want to talk about how housing justice affects your neighborhood, then you are the audience for that message, but you're also the neighborhood that we're talking about. And so we want to be talking about the change that you can see, how it's going to affect you. And we want to be talking about how you matter as a voice, as a member of this audience that can help to make a difference. So those things are not separate. In a lot of cases, we're going to see you are making a difference for your own community. So you are both the audience for this message as well as the subject for the change we're trying to create. Again, I think this is something that comes much more naturally to community-based organizations where you really understand and value your audience. So you want to be thinking about sort of who they are demographically. You want to be thinking about how they relate to your organization. Are they volunteers? Are they people who have never heard of you before? Are they people who are part of a larger group that you have an opportunity to address that is maybe not particularly engaged with your organization yet? How can you sort of change that relationship? How can you think about how they are thinking about you? You want to be really thinking about sort of where they are emotionally and mentally right now. Are they worried about the start of the school year? Are they worried about the election? Are they thinking about how the pandemic is still affecting them? And sort of what are they worried about in this moment? So all of those concerns, all of that reality of how people are living, that is going to help you make more relevant messaging. You also need to have authentic messaging. So where relevance is about who is listening, authenticity is about who is speaking. That partly means who is speaking, who is carrying the message as an individual person. So who are you putting in front of a crowd? Who are you handing the megaphone to? Who are you having sign your messages? Who are you putting out there in your press release as an expert voice? That individual, but it's also about who you are as an organization. Why is your organization talking about this issue right now? Why are you the right ones to be talking about it? Authenticity is something that must be earned over time, and it needs to be renewed constantly. So this is not something where you can sort of check this box off and then like, yes, people believe in us. We did the right thing last time around when we had this campaign. Now people know who we are. You want to always be reminding people of why you are the voice that should be listened to and making sure that you are elevating and communicating an authentic voice. And it's especially important when we have a really crowded space. So when everybody is talking about the same thing, when there's a lot of noise out there, we see that right now with the election. There's so much noise about it right now. Everybody has an opinion. So the authenticity that some voices have developed over time, now is a time when they are cashing in on that. If you are somebody who has shown that you are an important voice in your community on this issue, on whatever it might be, for the last 6 months, for the last 2 years, for the last 10 years. This is the moment when everybody has an opinion, everybody has a take, when you are going to be listened to, and you're going to be find yourself with an audience that still wants to pay attention when they are tuning out so many other voices. I want to make sure we leave plenty of time, so I'm going to, well, I've already been talking fast. I'm sorry. I know I have so much to say. A couple of quick examples of sort of how you can do this in practice. So we have these 5 elements: urgency, need, impact, authenticity, and relevance. A thing that you can do is sort of a really like hands-on tactical thing as you're editing your own messaging, whether it's a letter or a press release or an email, is to take a highlighter out and say, where are we exemplifying, where are we sort of demonstrating these elements? So in this case, if we look at these 5 elements, we see that urgency is happening really explicitly right here. We are saying, this is our time. That is about a moment. That is about change. That is about this moment in time. Tomorrow's primary. We know when it is happening. Anytime you're using time language, you're probably using urgency. So we want to make sure that that is involved there as well. And then you have all these other elements. So I'm not going to go through them one by one, but we can see that every part of these brief 2 paragraphs are doing some of this work. So when we talk about hundreds of us, when we sign it with a personal name, that is that authenticity. That is saying, we're a part of this. I'm here with you. I'm an individual person who you have heard from before. We talk about relevance by talking about where somebody is. Where is the audience? What have you been doing? And including them in the movement, saying we, that sort of that collective language makes it relevant. And then the need is right there. The impact is right there. We're talking about what is the change we want to see. We want to talk about how we create that change. So everything you put together, if you're trying to highlight your messaging and you see that a particular paragraph or a sentence isn't really doing any one of these things, that's probably language that you can cut. If you see that 90% of what you're putting out there is really about need and you haven't really said much about impact, there's a balance there that can probably be shifted. These things aren't always going to show up in equal measure, but they should all be present in everything that you're putting out there. And depending on your moment, your opportunity, you're going to want to lean toward one more than another. A couple of quick examples, I think, where organizations that we've worked with have done a really great job of this. I'm showing some ads here just because it's sort of the easiest thing to see visually. But all of these messages are about sort of bringing people in a way that makes the experience that we are talking about feel real. So in the first one here on the left, we are showing an individual person making their own commitment to the change they want to see in the world, making their own thing, and then inviting people in. This is about, like, let's do this work. In the second one here, this is, I think, a really great example of how we take, we're talking about statistics, which is one of the hardest things to talk about because they're boring and people get upset about having to see a lot of numbers. It's hard to make them make sense. We are pairing the idea of a specific data point, a specific call to action, with just showing the visuals of the community that people live in. And that makes it feel relevant. So it's very immediate because it feels like the kind of video that anybody can walk outside their door and start taking. We are used to seeing that sort of content online. So it sort of brings that authenticity sort of right into it. When we are talking, we're gonna have a couple of examples here from the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which I think does all of this work really well. If you're not following them, I encourage you to. They do a lot of work organizing domestic workers, house cleaners, home care workers. Some of their messaging is talking to the audience of the workers themselves. And so here's where you see that direct language. So when we're talking to limpiadoras, that is saying, this message is for you. We are okay excluding vast sections of the audience that might be interested in this messaging because we are not talking to them right now. We are only talking to workers themselves. We are talking to them directly. In other situations, we want to be elevating the voice of the workers themselves. And so that's what we see here in a positive way. We are highlighting these personal stories, and we are saying, these voices matter. We want you to hear from them. And then the third example here is talking to an audience that we want to motivate to find themselves in this work. We want them to understand what the need is, even if they are not currently living that need. And so we are connecting the idea, not just of pay. So we're not talking actually about individual pay rates, which is, this is about a minimum wage campaign. We are talking about the hard work that is done. How many hours a week? People understand that, paying their rent, making it feel like something that can be relevant to you, that you can understand the need that is happening here, even if you are not particularly affected by it in your own day-to-day life. So as we shift our audiences as we shift our focus, we're able to shift which side of these elements, which particular elements we're going to be elevating most, and which voices we're going to be talking with. And then sort of the very baseline thing, what I encourage everybody to do is you sit down to put together a messaging plan or particular piece of messaging is answering these questions. What do you want your audience to feel? This should be the first thing, actually, because people are really motivated by their emotions, by sort of the things that we care about. So do we want people to feel outraged? Do we want them to feel hopeful? Do we want them to feel optimistic? Do we want them to feel angry or sad or heartbroken? There should be a powerful emotion at the heart of everything that we put out into the world. Secondary to that is what we want our audience to know. This is often when we talk about impact. This is where we talk about sort of the mechanics of change. When is there going to be a vote? What is the ballot proposition? How do I get registered to vote? What are the sort of the facts on the ground that people need to know so that they can believe that their action will make an impact? And that's when we lead to the third question here, which is what do you want your audience to do? In most of the communications we put out there, especially when we're talking to our base audience or those persuadables, we want to give them something that feels valuable, that is substantive, and that is specific. So we want you to show up at a meeting. We want you to call your member of Congress. We want you to show up at a community meeting. All of these things can make a difference. We want you to hold a sign. Sign a petition. There should be a specific call to action in the communications that we're putting out there, especially when we're talking to a broad audience. And that's it. I know that was a lot, and I'm sure that I've been seeing the little chat thing pinging at me, but I've been trying not to read it so that I wouldn't lose track of what I was saying. But I'm really excited to hear what folks have to think and talk about some questions.
Yeah, Will, thank you so much for that. And yes, lots going on in the chat box, questions being put into the QA. So we're going to dig right into that. And we're going to start with some questions for you. But what I really want to also do is thank you again. Thank you for the presentation. And also welcome Dr. Tiffany Manuel, who is the founder and CEO of The Casemate, who, if you've been coming to these sessions, you've seen her. She's been our nearest and dearest partner in this work since we got going, and even before that, it was we started figuring out what this work was going to look like. And then also Ruth Bernstein, who is the CEO of EMC Research, who's been partnering with NPH and the affordable housing community for decades on public opinion polling research, and has just brought such great perspective to this project. And I really wanted to have you all here because we can't put all the weight on Will's shoulders. All of this work that Will is doing is informed by the research, the project, the shaping that's been done through this project. So we really wanted to make sure that we had a multitude of perspectives to be able to get at some of these questions. I think a lot of these questions are not black and white. So maybe even amongst this panel, we're going to be hearing some different perspectives from you all in terms of the questions that folks are asking about. And I want to start with a question that I'm going to send to Will first, and then I'm going to send to Dr. Manuel. Will, when you opened up the slides, one of the first things you put on there was you were laying out the opportunity and the threat, or maybe they were side by side like this. You laid out sort of where the opportunity message was and then what the threat was. And some of that was around loss aversion. And in the playbook and in previous sessions, Dr. Manuel has really talked about utilizing that loss aversion sometimes directly in order to mobilize people towards the opportunity. So I was wondering if you could share a little more, Will, in terms of practical application. When do you lean into the opportunity? When do you lean into loss aversion? Like, how do we navigate that focus?
Oh, I mean, I'm a natural pessimist, so I feel like my instinct is always to go toward the threat language. I think it depends so much on your audience and on your moment, what you're trying to create. But I think in many ways, people who have not, I think it's a quicker path oftentimes to use threat language. It is a shortcut to an emotional core for people. Getting people to believe in a better future takes work. You need to present a positive vision that is engaging and that is also convincing. So, and it is that second part of saying that future is something that we can build, that we can actually move toward, that I think is oftentimes really challenging and that takes time. We're just saying like, hey, your kids won't be able to afford to pay rent. You'll never see your grandkids again. Feel like it's just such a shortcut to the things that people already are worried about, their existing anxieties, that I think oftentimes like it's just faster. I don't know that one is better. I think it really depends on sort of what is happening in particular.
And Dr. T, I want to add onto this before I send it to you, because Rachel asked specifically, she gave a specific example in the QA box here. She said, how, for example, does building density not cause people to lose what they like? For example, single family neighborhoods, a big yard. How do you get people to think about the other benefits? So sort of carrying this question forward into a more concrete example, what's the role of loss aversion and opportunity in a moment like that?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm glad that folks are digging in on that. And I was really happy to see that and as part of Will's presentation, because I think oftentimes our messages are lopsided. They're either a lot of threat and very little opportunity, or what I would call a gain frame, or there are lots of gain. It's sun and roses and sunshine, and there's not enough of like, hey, but it's sunshine. However, if you don't get yourself into this movement, it ain't gonna be sunshine for long. So what I would say about that, the balance of that is really critical. And I would say there is a lot of social science on this in terms of how it affects people's decision-making process. When you start with the loss frame, which is what we usually do, and then try and go to a gain frame, it doesn't work. We know from a lot of good social science, what happens is that cognitively, it takes people a lot to work themselves out of the negative hole that you just dug for them when you go threat first. Right. So, and there have been lots of just studies about this, like head to head and political forums and public health and a lot of those kinds of things. When you go negative and you go down, right, you send people in the rabbit hole. This is really bad, and you dig a ditch for folks, and it's really hard cognitively then when you want to say, but wait, we can do something great together. That kind of ascension takes a lot for folks to turn their kind of thinking around and then get excited and aspirational about what can be done. So so we know that the opposite actually happens at a much faster. Our brains actually respond faster when you do it the other way. Position the gain frame because it allows folks to have the aspiration that allows them to lean in, and then you say the loss frame, and the loss always is what you lose if you don't lean into this conversation that we're having. It's not that you're going to lose your kid's future, but it's that, listen, if you don't come with us, right? So it's if you fail to show up for this conversation in this moment, then those negative consequences happen. So it's always a negative or loss frame relative to your participation or not. We need you. You don't show up. We may not be able to we may not be able to turn this around without you. So it's always that gain frame first and then loss. And to the extent that you can balance those out, you get a more powerful result. When I think about the gain frame is all the values that Will was lifting out and all the values that Ruth was talking about in her presentation last time. That's the gain frame, the better tomorrow. You want your kids to have a decent place to live. And this is I think it was Rachel, to Rachel's point about density, right? So it's all the things that people want that they gain. What do they gain by having more density? Like, you got to tell them very, very clear. For a lot of folks in the Bay Area, we know that it's a part of making room for folks like your kids who want to have a place. Right now, they don't have a place in a single family neighborhood. It's just not working. They can't afford it. They don't think they'll ever afford it. So they're moving to Minnesota. How about that? Where Minnesota's are greater than fear. How about that? You know what I mean? They're moving to a place where folks are making room. So either you make room too, or you're gonna lose your kids, right? So we want a future where our kids who grow up in the Bay Area actually have a place here. They have the ability to start families, and they have the ability to find meaningful work, and they have ability to make the contribution to the Bay Area that we want our kids to show up and be able to provide. And if we fail to show up in this moment for the movement, we're going to lose the ability to see our kids, right, prosper and thrive in this community. That's why we need to. So that balance that I thought Will's presentation was perfect in terms of just that opportunity frame, and then follow right by the loss frame about what happens when you don't show up. So just to be very clear about that, you need both of those in a message to be as persuasive. So don't leave one out, right? Because for all the reasons I just talked about. So hopefully that's helpful. I'm happy to talk more about that if people have thoughts or questions or
yeah, that's super helpful. One of the through lines I'm hearing here is there's always a loss. Like, so to the question there about like, well, they just, density is going to conflict with what they want, but what they want actually isn't an option. If you want to keep single family homes, but you do want a place for your kids to live, and you don't want people to be living on the street, and you don't, like, there is a lasso helping them confront that. This is a follow-up, and I'm going to send this to you first, Dr. Manuel, and then to you, Ruth, because we got a research lens, but I'm sending it to you first, Dr. Manuel, because this is your old stomping grounds. An anonymous attendee says, well, how about some of the housing framing done by the Frameworks Institute, which of course is where I think you started some of the just seminal research years ago about what was happening with affordable housing messaging. In some of that national research, and it looks like they're pointing to a report that came out in 2018, that positive balance messages are going to be more effective. Does that impact at all the national research versus the Bay Area research we've done in terms of how we should be thinking about applying these findings?
No, and in fact, that research actually is very well embedded, even in the playbook now, as you all see it. So as part of the values, the kind of the values we talk about, attached to this conversation that you want to lift up, we took both into account that national level research that's tested some of those values, but then look even more closely at what EMC has been able to do with respect to what's happening in the Bay Area. And I would say from the national version, there are some values that I think just are just resonant across the country. Like no matter where you are in the country, that health and housing message right now is a winner. I don't care where you are, not just for COVID-19, even before that. We just got through doing some work in Connecticut. I mean, just to hear folks talk about the stress of having to work so much just to be able to have a home, and what it's doing to their relationships, their marriages. I mean, this was not even folks who were talking about affordable housing in particular. They were just saying, shit, it just costs so much money to live here. Like, we're the stress of that is having deep implications for our families, our mental health. We talk a lot about that, and how that stress is being passed on to our children. And that was some of the most profound conversation I would say we're hearing across the country. That's resonant throughout. And so I think, Ruth can talk about how that played out in the Bay Area, but, clearly is well there, but there are values that are larger that sweep the whole country. And then there are some that we looked at just specifically for the Bay Area. So the Frameworks research came out with a couple of values that are really important for certain kinds of conversation. One of the values Frameworks lifted up, which was very helpful, was fairness across places, which is a nod to this issue about regionalism. It's not okay if one community in the Bay Area has all the affordable housing and none of the other surrounding communities do anything about that. They don't feel like it's their obligation to lean into that conversation. Not okay. Regions rise and fall together. We know that, but how do we communicate that broader regionalism conversation? When you lift it up as fairness across places, you get people to lean into this bigger conversation that it actually undermines the entire Bay Area as a region when you've got some communities that are thriving and have affordable and others do not. And specifically talking about how those parts of the region are undermining the success of the entire region because we're not thinking about, right, the distribution across. So all that to say, I can certainly talk a lot about that, but some of the national level research has been really helpful. We tried to point that out in the playbook. And then also wanted to also make sure that we look specifically at the values that were being lifted up in the Bay Area. So I'll pass it through because that was a lot of what came out in the polling data from EMC.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. T. I mean, I think one of the big things that, there's the national research, and then we looked at the Bay Area, and like you said, there's a lot of commonalities, but also some differences. And one of the big differences, I think, when we look at national versus the Bay Area, one of the big differences is the demographics and the overall ideology of the Bay Area. So, nationally, we're all seeing the national polling on red, blue, and the presidential race that is not reflected here in the Bay Area. We are much bluer, we're heavily Democratic, even among independent voters. So just ideologically, we're very different than the rest of the country, which plays into all values and everything else. And then like other urban areas, the cost of, as Dr. T was talking about, the cost of living here is just higher. So, you know, everything is even more escalated. We also have certain traffic patterns that you know, a lot of traffic, which other communities don't have. But, you know, that goes from national to Bay Area. You know, we can also spend hours here talking about the different parts of the Bay Area, which we didn't do in this research, but we've done a lot of in some of our other research. You know, just the difference, if you look at the two ends of the Golden Gate Bridge, San Francisco and Marin, you know, are massively different. Both, you know, demographically, their attitudes about this issue, their attitudes, you know, talking about where, you know, density and not density. So, you know, so I think we have a lot of those differences as well, which we can't really get into all of those details, but we have to remember that when we go from national to Bay Area, there are differences. But even when you go from Bay Area to maybe the, you know, the city of San Mateo are different as well. And you have to know your community and tailor to that community.
That's great. Thank you both. I'm going to read a question that I'm going to send to you first, Will, but really this is one where I think everybody should be weighing in on. This came from Matt initially, but got lots of +1s in the chat box. Will says, I'm really challenged by the idea that we're looking for long-term narrative shift, but not supposed to question the status quo of home ownership as working for all communities. Then I'm going to read a couple comments because people added to this. There was some pretty robust engagement there. Someone said, well, are we talking about avoiding the issue with contrarians, or are we actually sidestepping the issue altogether? And then someone else said, you know, wealth transfer matters. And so how do we talk about how that can happen for communities of color and low and middle income folks if we're not talking about home ownership? So Will, I'm starting with you because in your messaging review, you flagged that as a place that could be really problematic depending on who your audience was. Do you want to add to this idea of the great American dream and where that fits in with
It's a really hard one, I think. I think that, like, I'm not surprised that this came up and that people are really talking about it, because it does feel like it is central to creating the change we want to see. There has to be a change in the ways that people can thrive, and that having there be a single model of thriving that is becoming a homeowner, I think is antithetical to that. When thinking about the messaging, what I want to do is, we want people to feel and think a certain way. We want them to feel hopeful about the Bay Area that we can build. We want them to feel like that better future is at risk. And so to the extent, but we also know from the research that we've seen that it's just such a core, deeply held, like ingrained belief about home ownership, that what I would want to do in my messaging is not try to dig out that core belief and do the work of sort of like removing it from somebody's heart. What I want people to do is care about the change we want to make and feel like they're a part of it. And so there may not be a way, depending on your particular goals and the change that you're trying to create, to make that change without challenging that belief. But when there is something that is such a big roadblock, if there's ways that we can create change and make the progress we want to make that doesn't involve directly confronting that really painful, difficult fight, yes, I mean, maybe it's cowardice. I feel like there are ways that we can make progress that avoid that issue, and we can take it as something that is not our primary messaging point. That doesn't mean we'll never answer a question about it. That doesn't mean that we are not trying to help renters thrive. Like, there are so many things that we can make that actually make progress on the issue without starting a fight about that word or about that ideal. And I think that that's maybe the place where I want to be, is saying maybe we're actually undermining the importance of home ownership to thriving. Maybe we're actually lifting up renters, but we are not making the fight be about that thing. But I think this is a place where we're probably going to see a range of opinions and views, and I'd love to hear more from other people.
Yeah, let's, folks, drop your thoughts in the chat box. I'll keep sharing them with our panelists as you share them. Alex says that's difficult to hear, but I also want to hear from our panelists as well. Dr. T, I see you're off mute. You're ready to jump in here.
Yeah, man, I agree with Will, and I would say that's probably one of the tough strategic decisions that we have to make as part of a movement. Like, we've been handed a set of circumstances that are not always great, that come with a whole series of dominant narratives, a lot of which are just very unhelpful. We can't take all of that on at one time, but we can be strategic about when and how we choose to fight on those long-term narrative shifts. So I think in the playbook, we're trying to take that on with some of the language. And the strategy in the playbook around this issue is not to directly try and undermine that by pushing harder. You know, if it's a dominant narrative, trying to undercut it by heading right into it is usually disastrous, because then you start arguing about that, and you go down that rabbit hole, and you're like, but wait, what was I trying to say originally? Like, wait, oh yeah, I was trying to get people to come to the meeting on Friday, like, right? And you ended up in this whole conversation that's right. But there are ways to kind of reframe the conversation or pivot so that you start chipping away at that conversation. And I think in the playbook, it's chipping away at this idea that there is this big difference between you as a renter and you as a homeowner. The fact of the matter is, whether you're renting or a homeowner, right, a lot of the same issues in terms of stability are issues that are right at your doorstep. So it's trying to chip away at this idea that there's some big separation in terms of the position of homeowners and the position of renters. When we did the focus groups, that was one of the things that was really resonant that came out of those sessions. The homeowners were like, I mean, they didn't feel, for the most part, they felt lucky that they had bought their homes at a certain time. So that was part of it. But they also were talking about how they were swimming upstream hard to keep those homes, that they were not kind of in the sort of cherry-picked position of saying, yeah, I got my home, I'm sitting on all this equity, I'm feeling pretty good. They were talking about, you know, the area has a lot of older housing stock. It's hard to maintain this stuff. It's hard to be a homeowner. And then when they went there, and then we asked them to think about renters, there was a lot more empathy for that conversation, because they were thinking about their own vulnerability, right? And then when asked to think about renter vulnerability in that moment, you saw that, oh, maybe we're not so different after all. So I think, you know, to Will's point, you can fly in the face of that as a dominant narrative. I would love to take that shit on, because I just think it's, but I also recognize that in the short term, we got to win some stuff. And that it may be a faster route to win some things in the short term and get it this long by chipping away at it, by trying to at least undermine the divide that now sits between renters and homeowners. And so if you are doing that in your work, and you're chipping away at it, you know, hey, I know you're a homeowner, but you're probably facing some of the same issues that lots of renters are facing, right? A lot of them are struggling. Say, yeah, right? That chipping away at that division, right, is getting us slowly to be able to start having people see their stake in common versus as separate. I'll stop there.
I want to read a couple more from the chat box before, Ruth, I ask you to weigh in as well. Peggy says that one of her big takeaways is that housing justice must be tied to racial justice as part of that bigger picture. And housing is fraught in terms of how people think about it, but talking about people and jurisdictions not wanting to be left behind in terms of advancing racial justice with that loss aversion angle seems essential, or at least the most promising, she concedes. We don't have an easy answer here, but it seems like a promising solution. So I wanted to share that because I thought that was a really great comment. And then just to keep adding more questions onto this issue area before I send it to you, Ruth, Matt says, so what are the situations where we can engage on this? Oh, Matt, I read your question wrong. When should we engage opposition? Totally different question. Leave that aside. But when should we be engaging on, you know, the American dream then? Are there specific areas?
When should we be engaging on the American dream, on the homeownership issue? You know, I mean, what we see in the values work is that people still, they really hold on to that value that homeownership is the American dream. And, you know, I think, like, as Will and Dr. T have talked about, you know, the problem is to come at that head on doesn't necessarily help us to get where we're trying to go, because, you know, we see over and over again, renters tend to be with us on our issues, right? They're with us on the 3 Ps, they're with us on most things. It's really the homeowners that are our challenging group to go after. And one of the things we have to remember is that many of the homeowners, they're not going anywhere, and we're not taking their home away. Like, we're not going to get rid of their backyard or their home or their the opportunity that they already bought into, right? So if we try to tell them that they put all of this work into their house and that this is their dream that they're living, and like Dr. T said, that many of them are struggling even to hold on to that house because it's their dream, we don't want to tell them that their dream was wrong. because we're trying to bring them around to our side to say, and we don't want to say that homeownership is the only dream, right? And that we don't want to, but we don't want to take away what they have. That's not going to help us get them to be bringing others into their community, however they're being brought into the community. And I think that's an important thing also to remember, going way back to where we were talking about density and increasing density in the community. And we've seen over and over again in communities throughout the Bay Area, single family homeowners complaining about higher density in their area. And, we're not going to take away their house and their backyard. So, we have to be able to talk about how the changes are going to impact their lives overall. It's going to be better for the environment. It's not going to cause more traffic. So, and it's going to bring in new people and help their children find a place. So, we can't take away the dream that homeowners may or may not may have, right? We can't. Does that kind of make sense? I don't know. I don't know, Dr. T or Will, you want to add anything to that?
I have enough questions in the QA box and those that were emailed to me to just QA you until tomorrow. But I wanted to invite the attendees. One of the things we wanted to do today was to really hear from you. I'm looking over here on my other monitor because that's where my chat box is, but to hear from you as I look directly into the camera. We want to hear from you. What are you working on right now that feels promising when you think about what you're learning from narrative shift, or what are you working on that feels challenging? And maybe we're already starting to get into that with this conversation about, not challenging homeownership, but would really like to see that. And I'll just read a couple, I asked this question at the beginning, but some of the things that people already identified at the beginning. Stuart says, our challenge is how we're going to move a shamefully weak city council to be an advocate to really preserve below market rate units beyond the original covenant date. So preservation. And Joan added to that as well. Preservation's really hard. People were +1ing those topics. So preservation definitely seems like a specific area where people are feeling challenges around how to apply this work. An area of opportunity that was put in the chat box. Gabby from SB at Home said she's really been marinating since last week on that whole concept that we are not the base. And so thinking about the different framing in terms of, how to reach the masses when they think differently than us, and we have to reconcile that. So what I want to do, and forgive me, this is new technology for all of us, but if you want to provide a specific example, could you do me this favor of, dropping your note in the chat box so we know what you're bringing to the table, and then raise your hand, and we're going to see if we can try this out where we put your audio on and let you dialogue about that with Dr. T. While +1 to the we're not the base, while you all are answering that call to you, I'm going to send one more question to our panelists here, and then we'll start seeing how folks are coming in here in the chat box about what you're specifically working on, and try to bring your audio on. One of the other questions we got, and this one was emailed to me and comes up in every convening and every conversation, is about this name the villain, talk about the bigger systems. And Dr. T, you talked about this a lot in previous sessions about how if we get too fixated on one single individual, Trump, for example, we lose sight of what the systems were in place that allowed him to be elected. If we vote him out this November, when we vote him out this November, there's still more work to be done. And yet people are really having a hard time with not being very specific about naming villains, because as Anat Shanker says, people cause problems are solutions that can be people solved. If they're not people caused, they can't be people solved. So how do you all think about messaging around this? Do name the villain, don't name the villain, don't get stuck too small, don't go too big. Let's start with you on that, Will.
Sure. So I would say there are a couple of ways of using villains, naming the problem, that can be really useful. And I like to think of it as, it's partly to make it feel real and concrete. And I think it's important to make it feel like it is not the whole thing. I think Trump is a specific case where it is unique in that I think there are many people who feel like getting rid of him is going to solve all of our problems magically, and that is incorrect. I think what we want to do for the most part is say this person or this situation, this particular whether it's a member of your city council or your governor or whatever it might be, they are standing in the way of a thing. And so when we defeat them or reverse the thing that they did, that brings us closer to this goal, but they are not the goal. They are the thing standing between you and the goal. And so defeating them moves you closer to that goal. So it's about that context of just saying they're not the problem, they're the one standing in the way of a solution. And so they may be the cause of it, whatever it is, but I think, yes, making it feel like a human scale, I think does really help. But I think we always want to be saying that when we defeat them, when we remove them, when we outvote them, whatever it is, that brings us closer to this goal that we have, the thing that we want to see in the world.
Dr. T or Ruth, either you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to opine on this, and this is probably a place where I sometimes differ from a lot of the folks in the messaging space who are increasingly saying like, call out the villain and do that. I think that it's true. You got to tell people what is the problem that you're trying to solve for. But I think too often we get fixated on a particular person, and all the things that you just said, Elaine, we go after that person, and it just and then folks are really disappointed. We kicked the person out of office, and we got somebody new, and we still can't get more density in our community, right? And so it's not the person, it's not the I don't care who the hell is in office. I want to put so much pressure on you, whether or not you're Democrat, Republican, or Independent, that when you get in that space, there's nothing else that you can do but lean into a movement that is about making sure we intersect stability. And so if we get behind how do we do that, that is really important. The other thing I'll say too, just about this issue in the housing space, which may be a little different from some other movements, is it takes so much to move housing stuff forward. Just the amount of stakeholders involved in even like one development. It's like, you piss off somebody, right? It takes so much to do this stuff that you can literally be locked in a fight around one building for years because of one argument that like pissed somebody off. And I can tell you there are lots of folks in California with this very same issue. I work in many communities where that is you got in somebody's craw, here we go. And now damn it, like you won't stand up for this issue because you're pissed off about something we said 2 years ago. So I would just say that the way that we try to deal with that in the playbook is to say, name the villain as the systems that we need to operate better. I don't care who you are, what you do, we need whatever it is. And I think if you look at a lot of the best work, I think, on racial equity, you'll see that same conversation coming forward. That it's not sort of naming people as racist that gives them power. You can do that if you want to, because there's a lot to be done with that. But the better thing is to say these systems are not operating well, and racism is baked into the structures. And unless we undermine those structures, it really doesn't matter who's in that position. You don't even have to be racist to be presiding over an institution that is inherently producing racist outcomes, right? That, I think, if folks have been reading Ibram Kennedy's work, that is the level that we're having this conversation. And so the language in the playbook is meant to get at that. Like, we are about what's happening in terms of structure. We're not going to get fixated on who it is, right? Because that leads us to the sort of fallacy that if we just move people around, the musical chairs of people, that will get outcomes. And that has proven time and time not to be the case. And let me just say one more thing. And it's hard, especially for, I would say, communities. They're hard for lots of folks. We promise, like, you get this person, I work so hard to do that. Then the next person comes in, the person you think is going to be, right, who should have a more progressive attitude, and they're faced, what happens is they get in and they're faced with the same structural constraints as the last person who was in that office. And all of a sudden, somebody who sounded really progressive when you were trying to get them elected, now it's sounding like the guy that just left, or the woman who just left the office, and you're like, what the hell put you in there for, right? So I just feel like we need to complicate that conversation in our narratives to really be specific that we are working on structures. If folks want to embody a conversation about how we get to better structures, let's have that. But we cannot be guilty of leaning into the cult of personality, which is where a lot of this conversation lands. So all that to say.
And I'm just going to add to that really quickly, because you talked about individuals, Dr. T, and I know this might not be so popular to say, but I would put groups in that. To just blatantly say all landlords are bad and all developers are bad is also problematic, because they have to be part of the change, because we're going to have landlords and developers in the future as part of this solution.
This is an awesome chat box over here. And Rachel says, organizers say no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. And I feel like that's a little bit getting at what you're saying here. Dr. T, you and I also, we emailed a little bit about this email I got from Color of Change. And I'm sorry, they didn't have a little easy open in a new browser. Otherwise I dropped the link in, but I'm going to read just a little bit to you all. It says, Alina, it seems like every 4 years we hear the same line. This is the most important election of our lifetime. But that's not what I'm here to talk to you about today, Alina. Look at those merge fields. I'm here to let you know what we're going to do after we vote, regardless of the outcome. And this email just gets into how we are and always will be up against opponents who don't want to see Black people get free from police violence. And it lists out some of the challenges we face. And then if that sounds depressing, they motivate you right after that. We're going to fight like hell to make this world a less hostile place for Black people. Let me tell you, this is not the time to get bogged down, discouraged. And they give us what the vision is, and they tell us what we're doing, and they give you the little goosebumps. We can do this because we have something our opponents do not. We have you. So I shot this over to Dr. T and said, should we look at this today? I think it's just one of those examples of not getting bogged down to like, if we can just get Trump out of office, we can fix this, because it's obviously bigger than that. So how do we position it so we're not setting ourselves up to disappoint the folks we organize and mobilize and engage with us just because the turnover happens and we haven't magically solved all of the issues we need to solve. I have two brave volunteers who have been sharing some of their background. So I'm going to try this out. Bear with us, folks. We are going to start with Isis, who wants to talk about how they are working on renter protections in the only community that doesn't have renter protections in the Bay Area. So Isis, I'll let you say more about that. You should have your audio on. Let's give it a try. Can we hear you?
Hey there.
Hi. I feel like I'm a radio DJ. Thanks for calling in. Tell us your issues. We'll get our panel.
Wow, you really dated yourself.
What's radio?
So, yeah, right? So, thank you guys, first of all, for doing this work. I really appreciate it. I am creating a nonprofit grassroots organization called El Cerrito Spaces. And the purpose of this nonprofit is to generate grassroots support for tenant protections in El Cerrito. But on a broader basis, it's really about housing justice. This is an interesting vignette, and I will welcome your feedback in terms of how to solve it. So just a little context. First of all, several years ago, my landlord increased my rent by 65%. At the same time, I lost my job, and I was diagnosed with precancerous polyps. So it was a perfect storm. Effectively, I was homeless and living out of my car. I'm a professional in the Bay Area. I work in technology. So for someone at my level, and I'm Black, for someone at my level, it was really eye-opening, an eye-opening experience that was traumatizing and led me on the journey that I'm on now, which is I'm back in El Cerrito and well ensconced, and am trying to work with a city council that is pushing a gentrification agenda in their planning commission. And I was actually shocked that no one on the commission thought about how gentrification would impact renters in our area, particularly Black and brown people. So I have brought it up to the city council, and I put in my application for the planning commission today and was told that there was a vacancy. But what I want to really talk about is I'm on the Tenant Protection Task Force. There are 4 tenants and 4 landlords. At the first meeting, the landlords pretty much tried to hijack the task force and call it a landlord and tenants protection task force. I got eloquently and all black on them. And I think I can hear the wheels turning in your head, because you probably know what narrative came out of my mouth. It was divisive. It had absolutely nothing to do with what you've taught me in these last 3 webinars. How do I come back from that, guys? William's scratching his neck. I'm like, oh God, that can't be a good sign.
That was an unrelated itch that I had. That was totally not at all.
So how do I come back from, how do I come back from that? How do I lead my landlords who are now scared shitless to this is an issue that affects all of us and we need to all be on board? And Ruth, I'm really glad you're shaking your head, because that works for me.
I'll just shake my head and then point at Will.
I'm going to go on mute now. Thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much, Isis. And, you know, folks, obviously our panelists who are in video and audio, they're going to be responding to this, but please, in the chat box, like this is a moment for all of us to be learning and sharing together. So would love to see your reactions here as well. And which of our panelists wants to jump in here first?
I'll jump. I just first want to do a snap, you know, listen. I think, you know, first of all, thank you for your courage and being able and willing to tell your story. And I think a part of the strength of what you said was about the authenticity in your voice. And that it you know, don't lose that as a strength of what you bring to this conversation. So I would say a couple things. One, just structurally, the way that task force was designed, right? Just from that, we've been talking about structure. Structurally, was set up for was not set up for success in terms of the outcome. We already know what tends to happen when you get renters and landlords in the same space, and then you ask them to talk about the issues specifically for renters. Homeowners consistently take over that space. There is a whole lot that happens. Tenants shrink either because they don't feel like they should have as much voice, or because they don't feel like they have the same level of ownership and community. Homeowners take over the space, and then you don't get the kind of parity of the conversation. So, you know, one of the things, and we saw that play out in some of the community voice sessions that we did. So I would say for those of you who are in communities where these task forces are being designed for community input, that ain't the way to do it, because you already know the dynamic that's going to happen, and that's a structural constraint. So redesigning that differently. For example, pre-flighting the conversation, as Ruth was saying, tenants are already with us. Give them the opportunity to have the first bite at that apple, to design some of that, right? And then reach out to homeowners, have them join a conversation that's already happening. Otherwise, the tenants don't stand that much of an opportunity to really come in that conversation and do it right. The other thing I would say, Isis, to your point, you know, I think we've all been in that moment where, I think I have that moment several times a day. Every time I watch, especially on Fox News these days, you have that moment where you just have to, right, to some extent, you may just have to say what it is you need to say and be done with it. Like, I need to be all eloquently black at this moment. I'll just have to take it there. But I think it's also a conversation we need to have about allies. There are times when you know that from the standpoint of, like, I am about to curse somebody out and it's not going to be constructive, I need to tag out, right? So who can I tag into the conversation as an ally who can stand in this conversation? I think about, you know, Moms for Oakland, when we got, you know, folks who were standing in between, right? The moms who were vulnerable in that moment, right? And, right, police officers and other folks who were trying to, right, evict them out of the home, right? You're standing in between that because you know they're vulnerable in that moment and space for a whole variety of reasons, and you need strong allies to do that. So one of the things I would say, Isis, is, are there other strong allies who can stand in the breach, when you need to tag out for just a moment, right? Same thing we saw in Portland when you saw the mom standing in between the protesters and the police. They were doing that not because protesters weren't out doing their work, but because they understood the vulnerability of folks in that moment, that we needed to have allies to be able to tag. And so all I would say about that is, you know, when you know you've gotten to that point where you can no longer be part of any constructive conversation because the anger is to the point where I'm just not even able to, right? Then are there folks that you are allies with who can stand in, that you can tag into that conversation, who can hold the line, right, while we think through the strategy at the next level? That would be a part of some of the recommendations I would share with you. But I get it. I think all of us are in this moment where there are times of the day where you just have to even just walk away from a computer like, listen, I just need a minute because I'm trying to understand why anybody would tell somebody to stand back, right? And I mean, that's the whole thing. But those of you who watched the debate last night, like, what in the hell? I can't even, I just need a minute to process, and then I can get back in the fight. Anyway, just going there. And that's how ISIS. Thank you for sharing that. That was excellent. And thank you for being part of the movement.
Thanks, Dr. Manuel.
Thanks so much, Dr. T. Will or Ruth, do either of you want to add on to that in terms of, you know, what?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I would, let me also just add, I just thank you for sharing your story and for doing this work. The way that you framed it, I think was interesting in that you feel like you have burned a bridge and you somehow need to repair it because of the way that you responded to that moment. And I would ask you to like think through a little bit the fact that you were pushed to that place, I think also demonstrates that like you're responding to something real. And it feels like you're putting the responsibility for repairing that difference and that gap on yourself entirely. And I think you should be maybe a little like more generous with yourself and know that it is not up to you entirely to do that. I also want to reflect what people have been saying a bunch in a different context, which is that there are no permanent enemies in this work, in the work that we are doing. And so, yes, like if you blew up at somebody and you said things that cannot be unsaid, that fact can't be changed, but that doesn't mean that you can't work constructively to make things happen. It sounds like the problem is not your unwillingness to work constructively and that you are not, as Dr. Manuel said, it's not structurally set up for progress, and that maybe the people you're working with aren't interested in making and working collaboratively. That may not be a problem that you can change by changing the way that you are speaking or the attitude that you're bringing to it. So I would say go to your next meeting ready to do the work, and as long as you keep on doing the work, that's what I would want from somebody who is on a commission, who is on a panel, who is in the set of decision makers in any room.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly. And Isis, thank you for sharing your story and really for stepping up and being part of the solution, because it's easy to stay home and complain. It's a lot harder to get out and do the work. You know, I would suggest, in addition to what Dr. T and Will have said, and I think one, don't feel bad for what you know at all. Like, you're there and and it's great that you're there. I would say figure out something very specific that you actually want to see happen, not just what you want to see happen at a next meeting, but what would be success in 6 months or a year? What is the specific thing you want to change? And follow the thread to how you actually get that to happen. So this group, the commission that you're on, might not actually be the final thread to make it happen, and start to work your way back. So is it something that actually the council's gonna have to decide? Start getting to know some of the council members who are allies. Start working both ends of making it happen. So you're on this group and this group is driving it, but figure out where the end has to come from and where you can get allies to help triangulate and to try to get a thing, and not just we need tenant protections, but like, what's the thing that you actually want to see? What would be success?
Thank you all so much. I want to do a really rapid fire reaction from you all and all of you in the chat box to this second volunteer, which comes from Alex. And Alex says, the question I've been holding from the work we've been doing on eviction moratorium and rent control is that many landlords do see our policy goals as taking away something from them. How do these strategies speak to those landlord-renter struggles?
Some fights you just have to win. I mean, I think that there may not be a special Jedi mind trick that's going to convince them that their interests are different than what they are. You might just actually have to convince more people who are not them to stand with you. I think there are going to be places where the progress we want to make actually is counterproductive to somebody else's goals, and like it may make it more challenging because they have real power, but you may just actually have to beat them. That's not a plan, I know, but like I think there are going to be oppositions that cannot be made allies, and sometimes that's just the reality.
I think that's right, and I think it's one of the reasons in the playbook to say that there are going to be contrarians that you may not be able to pull forward. What I would also say is, to Ruth's earlier point, is don't dismiss all of those folks in one day, because some of us, we don't have to get all of them, but we do got to get some of them, right? You can't kind of dismiss all those homeowners and say, well, we don't care about them. We can just, you're going to need some of them to come through, but you don't have to have, you don't have to get all of them. And I think so if we are more judicious in terms of what the goal is, I think that can help us a lot. The other thing I would say is, when you spoke about they think we're taking something away from them, that means all of their sense of loss aversion is on our side of the table, right? All of it. They think that this thing, you are taking something away from me and I am ready to show up and fight. So articulate the other part and give them the other stuff they're losing. What are you losing? Right? That's the piece that they don't usually have a conversation about. What are you losing because you're not joining us to make sure that we have whatever it is, greater written protections in our community? They don't actually have, they never consider that. And so we have to do a better job at lifting that up to at very least complicate that story. So there's a balance there, at least a balance, if not completely tipped in our favor, that you're actually losing more trying to sit on top of a single family home in a community that is like not right, leaning into what we need to for a more balanced kind of representation. So,
I'll add to that. If you can't get them to join you, if you can't get your opponents to join you, make sure that they at least respect you and take you seriously, because they might not join you this time, but you want to make sure that they know you are at the table, that your voice is serious, and maybe they'll work with you later, or at least they will take your position seriously.
That's awesome from all of you. And in the chat box, Liesl was following up on a recommendation that you said, Dr. T, is just, you can go find some landlords that do support you. There are some, and have them come speak about this. And this is something Ryan said at a workshop we did at the NPH conference last Friday, was, we can't underestimate how much the messenger matters, because we're talking today about the message, we're talking about these strategies, we're talking about our audiences, and sometimes we're not the messenger. Just like we need to be like, we're not the base, we need to think sometimes, maybe I'm not the right messenger from this. Who can I get to go deliver this message for me in a way that's going to make those landlords take you seriously, in a way that's going to make those landlords aware of what they are giving up. This has been amazing. I wish we could get through all of the questions, but given that, we cannot, what I want to commit to everybody here is that this is not it. This is not, we're not handing you the playbook, handing you these sessions and saying, good luck, great job, tell us how it goes. We are going to continue to have these conversations. We're going to continue to work together. We're going to continue to peer learn. I'm going to say more on that in just a second, but I really first just want to say again, thank you so much to our presenters today. Will from M&R, Dr. T from The Case Made, Ruth from EMC Research, Landre, who you can't see, but who's in the background there, running all of the things for us to help this conversation be so smooth. So I want to thank you all. And I want to thank you attendees. The chat box is always just so fun, and we're all trying to balance wanting to read everything and trying to also be up on what we're supposed to say next. And I want you to know, like, we go back and look at these chat boxes afterwards to pull out if there are questions we didn't get to, if there's comments we want to take in, because this is an ongoing process. So what does that mean? What to expect next? There are some planned items already in the works from our narrative shift project. For one, all of these resources, recordings, and materials we've been sending you after these sessions, don't worry, you don't have to search your inbox every time you're looking for them. We are working right now to bring you a coalition-focused website that can house and store and offer you these resources, recordings, and materials in one place. So that will be one really good hub for us to be able to utilize as a community. We're also creating additional content to support the work that's happening here. That includes bite-sized videos that can help introduce our project to others to bring more to the table, as well as tools that help you engage with the audiences you're trying to reach. We have a training series that is in development at this time, where we're digging in on specific breakout topics that will be probably starting in 2021, because we're so excited to have partnered with our statewide allies in the statewide narrative training series, and we really want to encourage folks to be part of that and engage in those sessions, and then we can pick up and offer our Bay Area specific lens and support and perspective through our trainings to this initiative and this table and our geo-focused audience specific special needs and opportunities. We're going to be developing sample content and collateral. There's of course Haven. If you haven't heard Ryan talk about this amazing arts and cultural multimedia events, I'm so excited for you to learn more about it. We'll be sure to follow up with some information about that in our post-session materials. But that is going to be a really incredible event that is happening in the month of October, and we'll have a lot of beautiful cultural like pop cultural, like gets everybody excited content coming out that we can use to reach new audiences. That's some things that we have coming out. I know, yes, it's happening. They're going to be on a rolling process, but we're going to be starting with that website, so that you don't have to go and piecemeal where to find all these things. So look for that first. It'll be coming, and then we can bring you along. Furthermore, we want to keep looking to you to tell us what you need. So please be on the lookout for the feedback form that's coming to you in coming days. Let me be clear, this is not the usual tell us how we did. Of course we want to know. We want pats on the back or to know how to do better next time. But this is more of a feedback form. Tell us what we can do for you in your work ahead, because we need to know what you need, what's going to make impact, how we together are going to carry this work forward. So that's going to be a place where you can weigh in to really shape this project, clarify your needs, and help us make this initiative together as successful as it can be. That's my whole spiel. I ran through my bullets. Thank you again, and I'm going to let the NPH Spotify playlist usher us out again. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, attendees. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon, and take care.
Thanks, everyone.